Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Sanger of the New York Times and our distinguished panel to the stage.
You guys, I always learn a lot listening to you guys. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. I'm David Sanger, the national security correspondent for the New York Times. And, you know, occasionally people come up and they say that they have a panel that needs no introduction. And I would certainly say this is a panel that needs no introduction. But as Henry Kissinger once said, that doesn't mean they don't like to be introduced. So, let me do just that. And their long biographies are in your materials, so I'll keep this very short. To my immediate left, Admiral Mike Mullen was, of course, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was, I think, probably involved in many of the most critical moments of the Obama administration's first term, including some of the most critical decisions they made about a number of major interventions and, of course, the bin Laden raid. My old friend, Senator Sam Nunn, of course, as the co-chairman of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. I know him for Nunn-Lugar and many other things, but I know him as the first person I call when I need some wisdom on issues nuclear. So I'm glad he's here. And former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, down at the end here, after a long and distinguished career in the Senate, was the President's second Secretary of Defense, and somebody who knows these issues backwards and forwards from two very different perspectives, sitting in the Defense Secretary's office and, of course, his many years in Congress. Admiral Mullen, let me start with you. You've been the chairman of this group that has tried to go look at our national security priorities in the broadest possible way. You were the one who told Congress very famously that the biggest threat to our national security was our debt. And while this report that you've turned out does not offer a doom and gloom version of what that is, it describes a number of course corrections that need to be made. And what struck me when I read the report was that many of them are things that you and your colleagues here have been saying for a few years. And so I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit, just summarize your major findings, and then talk a little about how the administration and Congress have done in moving in this direction.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to Pete Peterson and the Foundation just for continuing the drumbeat. And I think over the long term, it really is going to have to be the drumbeat that gets the town, if you will, to focus on these critical issues. For me, this started actually about the time I was chairman, 2007 or so, while I certainly had all these other challenges on the national security front. I really did believe at that time, and then 2010 was asked what the number one threat to the country was, and responded that I really believe then and believe now it's the debt that we have, and it's not an I mean, it's a very complex issue, but it's not an overly complex formulation on my part, because and I grew up in the budget and programming world in defense. Defense is about half the discretionary spending we have every year, and that pie is going to get smaller and smaller at a time where seemingly the national security challenges are increasing. And that really hits at the heart of our ability to lead. We've heard other speakers already today talk about the uncertainty in predictions and the uncertainty in the world that we're living in, which certainly gets validated every single day. So it was in 2012, roughly this same group of distinguished leaders came together to make a pretty strong statement about possibly looking at ways ahead. And then there's 23 incredible individuals who've got literally decades and decades of experience in this town, who've come together in a bipartisan way, which is pretty unusual as well right now, to try to highlight this issue. And there's no question, from my perspective, there are very difficult fiscal challenges associated with this to address the entitlement piece. Many of you have seen the predictions from the CBO this morning. Those are not new slides. Those are not overly new numbers, except they're getting a little worse. And I'm struck as I listen to this and talk about what would you tell the next president, and the dire predictions that are really starting to hit as early as the mid-2025, 2026, which is the end of the next president's time in office potentially. So we try to highlight the fiscal issues that are there, as well as the national security issues. And there are a couple of them that I'll mention. One in particular, I think there has been a military compensation commission most recently, which has reported out. This has been an issue that has been very difficult to get across the line historically, any version of it. If you want to, in my view, get a handle on expenditures in the Pentagon, you need to go where the money is, and the money is where the people are. It's roughly half the budget every single year, and we need to continue to attract and retain great people. But I think adjusting the compensation system, grandfathering it, as has been suggested by this commission, is just one very difficult idea to make things better for the future. We've talked about an additional BRAC in it. And I have admired Congress for years for putting this mechanism in place because it's very difficult. I am struck that each year we do a BRAC, we say we're 20% overhead. We execute a BRAC and we're still 20% overhead. At some point,
and now we're at the point where we don't even want to execute a BRAC because most of the members of Congress recognize that since they can only vote up or down on it, they don't want to start the issue to begin with.
Well, that's why
we're probably overdue on a BRAC by 5 years.
I would say.
I'm sorry. What was?
I would say it's about time. My only concern, and it isn't expressed in the paper, is the military is getting smaller and smaller. We exist in fewer and fewer places, and I worry a great deal about being disconnected from the American people. So when you close a base, you're out of that community forever. You're no longer coaching the baseball teams, going to church, et cetera, in the community. So there's a balance there. That said, we really do need to streamline ourselves, if you will, as suggested both in the paper. There's always discussion about buying smarter. Procurement is tough. I actually believe that if we get the people side of this right, we'll be okay as a military. And if we don't get the people side right, it won't make any difference what we buy. So I would emphasize that in particular.
So Senator Nunn, as I read through this, it makes an argument that you've made for many years, which is that smarter and smarter technology enables you to deal with this smaller force. And that the question here isn't how much we're spending, but that repeatedly we're not spending it in the right place. And the paper goes through some very familiar themes about why that is, including the fact that you have a Congress that is incapable of killing a program that is out of date, especially if they've got a significant constituency. It reminds me of Secretary Gates's line to us one night when we were traveling somewhere during his time, which is, nothing in this town ever bleeping dies. You can imagine the bleep. So his point was, it was extremely difficult to kill a program even that the Pentagon found very little use for, and we'll get to Secretary Hagel on this in a moment. So you've long advocated that the problem here is not just the systems of the program, it's the Congress itself. So tell us what we need to do.
Yeah, as I see it, David, first I agree with Mike's comment. I think we've got to get to the people issue over a period of time, and I think that's essential. Basically, the defense budget is being squeezed from the top line on the overall unrestrained growth of entitlements in the larger budget for the whole society. The bottom line of the Defense Department is being squeezed within the defense budget, whatever the top line is, by the growth of personnel costs retirement costs, health care costs, all of those things. So the top line and the bottom line have to be addressed. I think the grand bargain would be for the military people to say, while society is addressing the entitlement programs at large over a long period of time, we will address those within the Pentagon, because both go together, in my opinion. As far as Congress is concerned, yes, Congress has got to reform itself. And I think the deal there ought to be the Pentagon ought to be willing to reform, but Congress ought to be willing to reform too. And there are a lot of things you could talk about, but right now you've got a budget committee. Both of the gentlemen on the panel before were head of CBO, and the budget committee works with CBO. They set the overall macro. Then you got the authorization committee, which is supposed to be a ceiling, and you got the appropriation committee. So everybody who wants to keep a program alive, to get to your bleep comment, has got 6 cracks at the apple, because that's 3 on the House and 3 on the Senate. And it's awfully hard to ever kill anything, because somebody's going to get it in one of the bills, although the budget committee is the broader. I think you need only 2. You can combine the appropriators and the authorizers. That would make a lot of sense. Or you could make the appropriation committee the budget committee. You can quarrel that out within the Congress, but you can't keep going the way we're going right now. So that would be a major reform. Then I would take, if you combine the appropriation and authorizing committees, you would basically then, but you could comprise the budget committee of the ranking and chairman of those respective committees in the House and Senate, and make those the budget committee. And then you would have the people responsible for the carrying out and execution of the budget that would also be the ones who are making the budget. I think that would make all sorts of sense. The other 2 reforms, I think and Chuck has had direct experience on the executive, and Mike has too, so they'd have probably different ideas on this, but I think we have tremendous business leaders in this country. And if you took the secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and you had a bipartisan agreement that could start in the Senate to make those positions normally a business leader and start looking at the business side of the Pentagon. You can't run all of government like a business, but you can run large sections of the Department of Defense like a business. And the defense agencies come to mind. We've got all sorts of things that could be done to make those more efficient. So if you had the Secretary of Army, Navy, and Air Force, all business leaders, no matter who was president, Republican or Democrat, and then make either the deputy or the Undersecretary of Defense a business leader. And at least try it for 4 years, and let's see if we can't bring business methods to the Department of Defense. The final reform I would throw in on Congress is you need 2-year budgets. We tried that on the authorizing committee, and you can't do it without doing authorizing and appropriation. Otherwise, authorizers just make themselves irrelevant. But Congress is basically binging on budgets. At any one time, there are 3 or 4 budgets up there. And that's reflected in the Pentagon. You got churning budgets all the time. So we're binging on budgets, and we're starving for oversight. And that's one of the reasons I think the American people have lost a lot of confidence in the federal government. And why we see so much disillusionment is because they recognize instinctively nobody's watching the thing after it's created. We create, but we don't watch it. We don't give oversight to it. So those would be just a few things I think we ought to focus on.
So, Secretary Hagel, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well, and one more. Early in the Obama administration, in the first year, there was an idea kicking around that one way to get at some of these issues is to have an overall national security budget. Would combine DOD, State Department, AID, and even some elements of the intelligence community. And the idea was that as threats emerged, ISIS didn't exist then, but it's a really interesting example. You could begin to move money so that you weren't immediately necessarily focusing on the military solution, but instead perhaps a diplomatic, an aid solution, whatever, to keep these things from spreading. This idea lasted somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds by the time it hit Capitol Hill. It would obviously disenfranchise a lot of different committee chairmen, not even just the committees that Senator Nunn was just describing. From your time both in Congress and in the Secretary's office, is this a concept that could work? Is it something that we should try to bring back as we're into this presidential season or not?
First, thanks, David, and to my friends, colleagues here, and also to the Peterson Foundation and to Pete Peterson, who all of us in Nebraska are very proud of. He reminded me again that the center of the universe is Kearney, Nebraska, where he's from, and I always listen carefully to what Mr. Peterson says, but he continues to make big contributions to this country and a better understanding of these big issues, so thank you. As to your question, start with the last point, a unitary budget. I think we are at a point now in our country and the world, because we're seeing a new world order being built. It's being reflected in our politics, if anyone's not noticed. We're seeing a new political order being built in this country, and it's happening all over the world, and that's going to necessitate some new thinking, some critically new thinking in our government, in our governance process. We really haven't governed in this country for a number of years. We've got a Congress that's paralyzed, an executive and Congress that doesn't get along, doesn't talk, and it has really not just polarized our country, but it's paralyzed in many ways every institution in government. We're talking specifically about our national security enterprise. So I think this kind of thinking is worthy of some exploration. Obviously, the reason that didn't go more than 24 or 48 hours in discussion is because what Senator Nunn talked about, specifically, you have so many committees and subcommittees in the committees and so many special interests that are represented in the Congress that no one wants to give up any power, any authority, any oversight, and that's reflected in, I think, in one of the biggest problems that we have. And Mike talked about it, as did Sam. The Congress essentially every year restricts more and more of the Pentagon's authority to really manage. And I'll give you an example. Every year the Congress passes the National Defense Authorization Act. And in that, and Mike Mullen had to deal with this as chairman, and Sam was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, is very familiar with this, but in this package that comes to the Pentagon every year are reams and reams, hundreds of pages of new reports, of new studies, of new things, and as Bob Gates so famously said, as you quoted, leaving out the expletive, nothing ever dies. So the Pentagon is faced every year with more and more and more and more requirements, goofy things, most of them, that do not add to our national security or enhance the use of our taxpayers' dollar that goes to national security, that restricts further and further our ability to manage. Mike talked about, and you talked about, base closings. Well, we haven't had really a major base closing since the 90s as far as the process. And the budgets I'd submit to the Congress, we would go forward and ask the Congress to look at this again, because the fact is Mike uses the percentage of maybe 20, is probably closer to 25% overhead that we're carrying that we don't need. And those are taxpayers' dollars that are obligated to national security that do not enhance at all our national security. So there's the reform process that both Mike and Sam talked about is badly needed. Yes, institutionally, reform always is required because we have to adapt and adjust to the new realities and challenges of our time. This is why it is time for some real intense exploration of how we do business. Sam talks about maybe more of a business approach to some of this. I think some of that is right, but it won't make any difference how many secretaries with business experience, and I started companies, I come from a business world, when you're restricted and you can't make your own choices. If the board of directors of a corporation took so much power away from the CEO and from his division presidents or her division presidents, I mean, it's going to end in disaster. And let's not forget, I used to say, as Secretary of Defense, I had 535 members of the board of directors I reported to. It's 100 senators, 435 House members, and a chairman of the board that sits at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and many times the two don't talk. And what gets caught in the middle of that is the Defense Department, and most important, not that the Defense Department is important, but what it represents, the national security interests of this country. Last point I'd make, to go back to a point that Mike made, the question you asked, and this is why what the foundation is doing is so important, and Sam's been talking about this for a long time. The economic power, flexibility, credibility of a country it directly corresponds and is proportional to a nation's security. I mean, just as Mike said, there is no other way to do it. And foundationally, if a nation doesn't have a strong economy, a growing economy, then that nation's options and capabilities are very limited. And always we need to assure, and we don't always do this, that we're matching our resources with our mission. Last point I'd make is sequestration. It is the most mindless deferral of authority and responsibility I've ever seen in my life.
But how do you feel about it?
Sequestration is still the law of the land. And I will end with this. One of the most difficult problems the Pentagon has, but any agency of government, but any business, is the uncertainty of your resource base. If you are uncertain as to how much your budget is going to be, and if they continue to say, we're going to take another $50 billion cut this year, but that doesn't affect at all the pressures that are on the defense establishment to deal with these new challenges, whether they're cyber, terrorism, Russia, China, and by the way, they're increasing. They're not decreasing, and the complications are increasing, but you're uncertain as to what your budget's going to be. That's disastrous, and that's what the Pentagon's been dealing with. You know, I walked into that job 5 days after I got there, and Sam helped me get there, and the chief financial officer walked into my office and said, Mr. Secretary, I got some bad news. Senator Warner's sitting out there. It was his fault too, Warner, but two leaders of this country that we all owe a lot to, Senator Warner and Senator Nunn. My CFO said, I got some bad news. Sequestration just went into effect today, and we have to figure out where we're going to cut $50 billion this year. Not budgeted for, because nobody believed it would happen. It was so crazy and so irresponsible. So we literally stopped training in every branch of service for months. We deferred maintenance. We deferred everything we could possibly defer. We threw our requisitions schedules off of new platforms. It disrupted everything. And then a few months later, we had the bright idea, not we, but some in Congress, to shut government down. That really helped for 16 days. This was right in the middle of budget preparation time. So, and I'm a great advocate of Congress, by the way, and I think we need Congress, and I support Congress, but, we have gotten way off the track, Congress has, and I hope this new election that comes up is going to bring something out of this, that we get ourselves back to responsible governance.
Well, Admiral, let me, Secretary Hagel brought up the election, and so let's turn a little bit to the question of how these issues are debated within an election. So, as you may have read, my colleague Maggie Haberman and I spent about 100 minutes with Donald Trump last month talking through his foreign policy and national security ideas. And I would say that in the area that this report covers, there were two major themes that came out of Mr. Trump's discussion of this. The first was we need more of everything, stronger defense, more ships. The Navy was a particular issue to him. Stop reducing the size of the Army force and so forth. And then at the same time, this concept that if members of NATO don't contribute more, we should pull back from NATO. If the Japanese and the South Koreans don't pay more for our forward presence there, we should threaten to pull back from those regions. And he added, for good measure, when I raised the question that if they wanted to go nuclear themselves, that was fine. That doesn't strike me as completely consistent with what you've been describing here, but it also reminded me that when people talk about defense in a campaign, they tend to go for big, broad, and tougher, and relatively little of what you're describing here, which is slimmer, smarter, and more targeted. How do you shift from one to the other?
I'm somebody that believes that the budget right now in the Defense Department is about right. Overall, I think there's a tremendous opportunity inside the Pentagon to be able to do away with the duplication that's there with the dramatic increase in the civilian population, the civilians who work there, in terms of their ratio with respect to men and women in uniform. And also generate, the kind of reports that Secretary Hagel was talking about, which seem to just pour in. One comment I'd make about those is, having made and signed off on so many of those reports, they go back to the Hill, and an incredibly small percentage actually have any impact at all. I've listened to candidates talk about the military being broken. I couldn't disagree more with them with respect to the military being broken. Yes, it's been, we've been at war for a significant period of time. This is the best force I was associated with over the course of 43 years. And yes, we've been through this mindless, almost perfect decision for its time, sequestration, in my opinion, in terms of representing the lack of courage and the lack of responsibility in terms of executing, sound fiscal as well as national security policy. But one of the things, and you're always going to have an argument about how big or small we should be. The core of that, I think, is our Army, and this is something I learned when I was chairman, and it goes back to from my perspective, the lack of getting buy-in from the American people with respect to the wars starting in Iraq. Which initially may have been, but as soon as the intel went bad, that was gone. And I view that we didn't have the kind of debate we should have when we make a decision to go to war, specifically at that time. And my belief is that if we're going to put 100,000 troops somewhere, and I don't agree with Bob Gates on this, that it's never going to happen again. I think he's probably okay with, it wouldn't be wise for the next president, et cetera, but I've been around too long to think that the possibilities aren't there. And that we make our Army small enough where we can do that, we can put 100,000 somewhere, but we can't sustain it. And at the core of that would be a requirement to call up 500,000 kids from all over the country in a draft to support the war. That would generate the debate in the country that, in my view, didn't take place in 2004, and it needs to be a very robust, intense debate, and then the decision gets made yes or no, and if it's yes, now you've got the American buy-in that I didn't see during these wars. Now that's political learning for me, and I recognize if you make the Army small enough to do that, we're not going to be as ready, and I'm willing to pay some of that readiness perspective to be engaged with a country and to be connected with a country, which we weren't in these wars. That's a fairly controversial position to take on the size of the Army, and I understand that. And that's the core, if you're going to reduce the Pentagon budget, if you're going to make it smaller, or the opposite, if you're going to make it bigger, more than anywhere else, you're probably going to either shrink the Army or build the Army. The Navy's, it's 272 ships today. It's going to grow to 306, I think, is what Admiral Greenert wanted, and there's a revised view that's being generated by the new CNO that'll probably be a little higher than that, but that's within reach.
Yeah. I think he said last week in a session I had with him, in the area of 320.
Yeah, and so that's doable. End strength in the Navy, end strength, the Marine Corps is coming down a little bit, end strength in the Air Force, those are all going to be steady. So in great part, as I said many years ago, I think the center of gravity for our military is the United States Army. It has been in these wars, it will continue to be, and that's where both reform and the future, I think, lies in terms of overall investments, although we need to invest obviously broadly in all the services. We also need to send our Air Force and our Navy out at a time where we are more isolationist, if you will, which happens after wars, and certainly the rhetoric you see in the campaigns reinforces that. That's somewhat natural, but the world isn't going to let us, I don't believe, the world's not going to let us just recede and put up walls, man our weapons, and hope nobody comes here, because it's going to affect us. I think we need to stay out there and engaged in the world in ways that really make a difference, in a world that, quite frankly, is begging us to do that.
So, Senator Nunn, two questions on this. So, first of all, if you brought a bill like Nunn-Lugar to Congress in its existing state and argued that you could do a huge amount of reduction of threat by paying another country to basically dismantle much of their systems, would that be a workable concept in today's environment? And a second question for you is, if you were advising Secretary Clinton, who said very little about the things that you've had in this report, at least in recent times in the election, how would you advise her to begin to talk about these topics?
Well, on the first question, Nunn-Lugar, I always am optimistic enough to believe that when there's a real crisis, the two political parties will come together. It's difficult now, it's difficult, but we've got some good people in the Congress. I mean, I think the system itself, you can say, is dysfunctional, but that doesn't mean they're not good, honest, sincere people who really want to lead. And you've got a Secretary of Defense now, Ash Carter, who I think is willing to reform and can work with the congressional leadership. I mean, John Warner and I didn't agree on a number of things, but when the crisis came, we were usually arm-locked and working together, and the same thing with Senator Lugar. So I'll always believe that people will rise to the occasion, but the occasion in the fiscal sense is here now, because every year that goes by that we don't address these issues, everything gets more difficult, both economically and politically. And so I think I'd like to see some real initiative in this area. The debate so far in the Congress, I would say that by default, Hillary Clinton is the most responsible fiscally. If you look at the analysis that the Committee for Responsible Budget has done, Maya and her group and Bob Bixby, Concord Coalition, they have an analysis of what each one of the candidates that still remains in the race has said. You've got Secretary Clinton, who basically adds on programs, pays for them, doesn't do anything, though, about the huge gap that we saw up there, which I think over the next 10 years is $3 to $5 billion to keep just relative to the world, to the GNP, where we are now, just the status quo. So she kind of keeps the status quo. Bernie Sanders massively increases taxes, massively increases expenditures, and still adds to the problem, doesn't subtract from the problem. Donald Trump, the problem with Democrats, generally speaking, Democratic Party, generally speaking, is too protective of making no change in entitlements, even over the long haul. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to that. But the problem with the Republican Party, they have massive tax cuts year after year is what they want, without saying how you're going to pay for them. The problem with Donald Trump, he wants both. If he wants both entitlement protection totally and massive tax cuts. So the Responsible Budget Committee, Maya and her group, have estimated he would add 10 to 15 trillion to the problem that you heard identified earlier. That's significant. That's significant. So we've got basically a debate that's going on in the presidential election that in terms of fiscal policy is totally absent. There's not being addressed. By far, Hillary is the most responsible, but even that leaves us in a big hole. So I think it's going to take a lot of alerted people around the country. And if I was advising Secretary Clinton, I don't think she can, under this atmosphere, get into all the details, but I think she has to chart, as Michael Peterson said in his testimony before the Congress, we got to take a 25-year look at this. We're not going to solve this problem in 10 years. This is a 25-year look. You've got to grandfather most of the people in the military today. You can't jerk the rug out from under people we've made a commitment to. I made one change that is saving billions of dollars now based on the final base pay on retirement that was put in effect some 25 years ago, but it's saving about $2 trillion a year now. So that's the kind of thing we've got to do in the broad budget as well as the other budget.
So Secretary Hagel, we have just a few minutes left, but the Republican Party and the orthodoxies that it reflected as you knew it when you were in the Senate, doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance, I think it would be fair to say, as Senator Nunn indicated, to what we're hearing from the presumptive nominee. If he suddenly had a change of view here and he wanted to bring in a few prominent Republicans who've been through this process before and sit them down and say, what should I say and how do I sort of dig myself out of the entitlement tax cut hole that Senator Nunn's described here, and what priorities could I get across that would lead to a stronger Pentagon but still not create that hole, what would you tell Mr. Trump?
Well, as we have just discussed the last half hour and the previous panel got into this, we may have to call upon Captain America to rescue us here as a presidential candidate before this is over. But as to your question, I go back and reflect on the conversation we've had here the last half hour. I don't think you can take your national security issue, responsibility question, and any dimension of it, funding of it, reforming inside unitary budgets, without a larger reflection that the American people have got to come to grips with. And I hope over the next 6 months we'll, now that we've passed the gong show approach to politics the last few months.
You think we passed that?
Well, maybe not, but not as many contestants. We'll sober up and we'll get serious. And this is very much the role of the media, by the way. You know, this continued fistfight confrontation, the media's got some responsibility here that
More than a little. More than a little.
They've not done particularly well at, but that's a different panel. But to your question,
I'll happily go on that one too. I've got a few views on that, but go right ahead.
But to your question, I think you've got to reflect, first of all, on America's role in the world. What do Americans want? What do the leaders think that the appropriate role of America is in the world today? Should we continue to be who we are, what we've been doing, take the responsibilities we have? Should we change that? Trump got into it a little bit, and this will play out by the conversation you just had with Mike a little bit about some of these issues. But that's where you've got to start, I think. And then you work your way down into some of the other dimensions of the governance issues, the instruments of government, how they're funded, committee reforms, Congress, Pentagon. But I don't think you can come at this in kind of a ricocheting from crisis to crisis way. And a lot of that we've been doing over the years. And I don't think it's anybody's particular fault, but we're living in this kind of world that just these things keep coming at you, and to step back into some kind of a zone where you really will never have the time to come up with these grand theoretical doctrines.
But let me ask you specifically on one element that that Mr. Trump brought up, which certainly has echoes in things that we've heard both from President Obama and from you and your predecessor and successor at the Pentagon, which is that we're in a world right now where we are paying disproportionately, particularly at NATO, where it's north of 70% of the budget. And a lot of Americans ask the question, it's all right if we're out there doing forward defense, but we're 25 years out from the fall of the Berlin Wall. Isn't it time to share this burden a little more equally? And while everybody's given speeches about that, very little of it has happened. Now, he's tapped into it with a threat that goes on the other side, which is, if you don't solve this, we're out of here, which you certainly have not heard others do. But talk a little bit about the point that's the general point that's being made there.
Well, again, it goes back, I think, to my larger question here. What is the role of America in today's world, tomorrow's world? Because it goes right to the heart of what Trump's talking about and others will talk about. And I would respond this way, 2 points. One is, I don't think there's any question that NATO, if we isolate on the 28 members of NATO, you've got only about 4 or 5 of those 28 members that are complying with the requirements as to how much of the gross domestic product a country applies to its national security. most all of those countries are underfunding their national security apparatus. There's no question about that. That needs to increase, and that needs to correspond with the realities and the challenges of the time. We should keep talking about that. But here's the thing that I haven't heard much about on the other side. Is it in America's interest to have NATO and for us to lead NATO and to continue to commit to the 7 treaty obligations we have in the world? 5 of those 7, by the way, are in the Asia Pacific. Is it in our interest to have ships and platforms and people in rotational ways versus stationary troops? I'd say yes. I'd say it's clearly in our interest. Our interest part of this equation, this debate, doesn't get played out as much. So I think we have to remind ourselves that this country is the only country on earth, because no one is in our universe as far as strength. We're a nation of laws. We have this incredible capacity to self-correct. We have the most flexible, largest economy in the world, the greatest military in the world. Mike's right. I mean, we're imperfect. We make mistakes. We're going to make a lot more. We had to have 27 amendments to the Constitution to try to get it better, and we're still not where we need to be. But still, there's no other country that can replace us. Now, do Americans want to continue to carry that burden and that heavy responsibility? I would add this and end this way. I'd say yes, is it worth it? Because the next great power on earth may not be as judicious and benevolent with its power as America has been with its power. Mistakes we've made, absolutely. I don't want my children to grow up in that world, or their children to grow up in that world. So I think we have to balance this debate. Yes, our allies need to do more, and I don't think we help the cause here by bludgeoning them publicly and personalizing them publicly. I don't think that's very smart, because it drives people back into zones of defensiveness, and then it always redounds not to our benefit, but those ugly Americans pushing us around again. We're imposing, we're invading, we're occupying. You have to be everywhere. You have to tell us what to do. So we've got to be smart. Last really will point I'll make, your paper this morning had Tom Friedman's column. Friedman has some pretty interesting points in that column, and I think it's worthy of a very insightful read. And he's essentially saying that we've got to manage through these big, complicated times. There's probably not in the near future, any big breakthroughs like the Berlin Wall falling or normalizing relations with China. These are complicated, big-time problems with very few easy, complete winners or losers. Let's be smart and wise and steady how we do this. And that was essentially the message of his column. I think Friedman's got it exactly right.
Well, thank you. Thank all 3 of you, and thanks to Pete Peterson and to the Foundation for this very illuminating conversation, and I appreciate your taking the time to do it, and all of you for participating.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, David.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a short break.
Thank you.
Please join us in the main lobby. Please return back here at 11 a.m., please. 15-minute break. Thank you.